The arena was already alive long before the lights came on. Outside, thousands of people streamed toward the massive building beneath the fading Alabama sunset. Some carried homemade signs. Some wore jackets embroidered with Elvis Presley records. Others arrived with folded arms, watching every unfamiliar face that entered the parking lot. Nobody realized they were walking toward a night that would be remembered far longer than any song performed on that stage. The date belonged to the spring of 1969. America was still grieving, still arguing, still healing. Every newspaper seemed filled with another story about division, another protest, another march, another funeral, another promise that tomorrow would somehow be better than today. But tomorrow had not arrived. Not yet. Deep inside the Montgomery Coliseum, workers rushed across the stage carrying cables, microphone stands, guitar cases, amplifiers, and lighting equipment. The smell of fresh paint mixed with hot electrical wires, spotlights slowly awakened one by one. The empty seats stretched endlessly into the darkness. Within another hour, every one of them would be occupied. Backstage, the atmosphere felt strangely quiet. Normally, before every concert, there would be laughter, jokes, musicians teasing one another, someone practicing a guitar solo, someone humming a melody in the hallway. Tonight, very little was said. Even experienced road crew members spoke in whispers. Nobody could explain why. They simply felt it. Something about Montgomery felt different. The concert manager walked past the dressing rooms carrying a clipboard. Every few minutes, he checked his watch, then the hallway, then the entrance, then his watch again. Security guards quietly took their assigned positions, more than usual. Nobody called it fear. They simply called it preparation. Inside one dressing room, Elvis Presley sat alone, still wearing an ordinary shirt. His famous stage suit remained hanging neatly against the wall. Its white fabric reflected the dressing room lights like polished marble. Several rings rested on the wooden table beside him. A Bible, a folded towel, a handwritten list of songs, and a family photograph that traveled with him everywhere. He stared at it silently. No one disturbed him. Not because he demanded privacy, because everyone who knew him understood something. When Elvis became this quiet, he was thinking deeply. A soft knock echoed against the door. "Come in." The door slowly opened. 4 elegantly dressed women entered together. Matching gowns, carefully prepared makeup, professional smiles. Yet behind those smiles, there was uncertainty. The sweet inspirations. They had performed before enormous crowds, worked beside legendary artists, sung in churches, recording studios, television shows, concert halls across America. Nothing about standing on stage frightened them. People sometimes did. One of the singers finally broke the silence. "You think tonight will be all right?" Elvis looked at her. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly stood, walked toward the women, smiled gently. "We're here to make music." His voice remained calm. "And that's exactly what we're going to do." Another singer nodded, trying to believe him. "I've been getting letters," she admitted quietly. "So have my parents." Another woman lowered her eyes. "My husband wanted me to stay home. He said this stop feels different." Nobody laughed, because everyone understood. They had all heard stories. Stories of concerts interrupted by hatred. Stories of threats. Stories of audiences divided before the first note had even been played. Elvis folded his arms thoughtfully. "I can't promise tonight will be easy." The room became completely silent. "But I can promise one thing. If anybody on that stage stands alone, it won't be you." No dramatic speech followed, no applause, only quiet understanding. One by one, the women smiled. The nervousness did not disappear, but somehow it became lighter. Outside, the audience continued pouring into the arena. Families filled entire rows together. Teenagers rushed toward seats as close to the stage as possible. Reporters adjusted camera lenses. Photographers searched for perfect angles. Vendors shouted while selling programs and refreshments. Yet scattered throughout the enormous crowd, small groups remained unusually quiet, watching, waiting, studying the stage. Nobody backstage noticed them. The house lights slowly dimmed. An enormous roar exploded through the building. The sound shook the steel framework above the ceiling. Thousands of voices merged into one. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" The chant rolled across the arena like thunder. Backstage, the musicians exchanged final glances. The drummer twirled his sticks. The guitarist adjusted his strap. The pianist stretched trembling fingers. The sweet inspirations quietly joined hands. No words, only a brief moment of silent encouragement. The stage manager lifted one hand. 30 seconds. Every heartbeat suddenly felt louder. 15 seconds. The curtain trembled. The audience grew even louder. 10. Elvis closed his eyes, took one slow breath, opened them again. The uncertainty was gone. Only focus remained. The stage manager pointed toward the entrance. "It's time." As Elvis stepped toward the brilliant white lights, the four women walked beside him, not behind him, beside him. The curtain slowly began to rise. The crowd erupted with deafening excitement, completely unaware that before the night was over, one decision made beneath those lights would leave an entire arena speechless. The curtain rose completely. A wall of sound crashed across the stage. Thousands of voices merged into one deafening roar. The spotlights ignited. Their brilliant white beams swept across the enormous arena before finally settling on the center of the stage. Elvis stepped into the light. The applause became thunder. People rose to their feet. Some screamed his name. Others waved homemade banners high above their heads. Camera flashes exploded like tiny bolts of lightning. For a few unforgettable moments, the world outside that building seemed to disappear. The band launched into the opening number with explosive energy. The drummer drove the rhythm forward. The guitars echoed through the Coliseum. The brass section filled every corner of the arena with rich, powerful harmonies. Behind Elvis, the sweet inspirations entered with flawless precision. Their voices wrapped around every lyric, soft when the song demanded tenderness, powerful when it demanded strength. Together, they sounded almost effortless. One song became another. The audience clapped in perfect rhythm. People danced between the rows. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders. Even many of the security guards found themselves smiling. Backstage, crew members exchanged relieved glances. Perhaps everyone had worried for nothing. Perhaps tonight would simply become another successful concert. As the evening continued, Elvis became more relaxed. His familiar smile returned. He joked with the audience between songs. He thanked the band. He introduced the musicians one by one. Every introduction received warm applause. Then, he walked toward the center microphone. The opening chords of Suspicious Minds echoed through the arena. Instantly, the audience erupted again. It had become one of the most anticipated songs of every performance. The drummer counted quietly. The guitars entered. Then Elvis began to sing. The first verse floated effortlessly across the building. The sweet inspirations answered each line with perfectly blended harmonies. Their voices gave the song a depth that seemed almost spiritual. People stood together swaying with the music. Even those seated near the back could feel the emotion rolling across the stage. As the performance built toward the second verse, the energy inside the arena became electric. Every musician was completely locked into the performance. Every spotlight followed the movement flawlessly. The audience sang along word for word. Then, during a brief instrumental break, it happened. From somewhere deep inside the crowd, a single voice shattered the music. The words were impossible to ignore. Cruel, ugly, filled with hatred, directed toward the women standing behind Elvis. For one frozen heartbeat, nobody seemed to understand what they had just heard. Then everything stopped. The drummer lowered his sticks. The lead guitarist slowly removed his hands from the strings. The keyboards fell silent. Even the echo inside the arena seemed to disappear. More than 30,000 people stared toward the stage. Nobody moved. The sweet inspirations remained standing at their microphones, professional, composed. But the pain in their eyes was impossible to hide. They had heard words like that before, too many times. One quietly lowered her head. Another blinked back tears. A third tightened her grip around the microphone stand. None of them spoke. They had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the safest response. Elvis stood perfectly still. His microphone hung at his side. His breathing slowed. The arena waited. Several members of the band exchanged nervous glances. The stage manager looked toward the wings. One producer whispered something into a headset. Nobody knew what would happen next. The easiest decision would have been to continue the concert, pretend nothing had happened, finish the song, leave the arena, forget the moment. Many performers had done exactly that before. But something about the silence felt heavier than the music itself. Elvis slowly turned. He looked toward the 4 women behind him. None of them asked for help. None of them expected a speech. Their expressions said everything. Years of carrying burdens that should never have existed. Years of smiling through moments that hurt. Years of proving themselves over and over again. Elvis looked back toward the audience. The spotlight followed him as he walked slowly to the very front of the stage. Each step echoed through the enormous building. Nobody dared interrupt. He lifted the microphone. For several long seconds, he said nothing. The silence itself became part of the moment. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, almost quiet. "I think," he paused, "everyone deserves better than what was just heard." The words drifted gently through the arena. No shouting, no performance, only sincerity. He turned toward the women standing behind him, then back toward the audience. "We came here tonight to share music. Music has a strange way of bringing people together. It has done that for generations. It should never become a reason to push people apart." The arena remained completely still. Not even a camera shutter could be heard. Elvis continued. "Every person standing on this stage earned the right to be here. They worked. They sacrificed. They practiced. They gave everything they had. They deserve the same respect every musician deserves. His eyes slowly swept across the audience. If we're going to spend tonight together, let's spend it remembering why we came. To listen, to sing, and maybe, for just a little while, to leave this place kinder than we found it. For another long moment, no one reacted. The silence seemed endless. Then, somewhere high in the upper seats, a single pair of hands began clapping. Another joined, then another. The applause slowly spread through the arena, row after row, section after section, growing louder, growing stronger, until the sound filled the entire building. Many people stood, others remained seated, but the applause continued to build like distant thunder rolling across the hills. Behind Elvis, the sweet inspirations looked at one another. One smiled through tears. Another quietly reached for the hand of the woman standing beside her. For the first time that evening, the fear began to fade. Elvis lowered the microphone. He glanced toward the band. The musicians looked back at him. Nobody needed instructions. The drummer lifted his sticks once again. The guitarist adjusted his grip. The pianist nodded softly. The music was about to begin again. But after what had just happened, nothing inside that arena would ever feel quite the same. The drummer lifted his sticks. For one brief moment, he hesitated. His eyes searched Elvis's face. Not for permission, for certainty. Elvis answered with a single nod. The drummer struck the snare. The familiar rhythm returned. The bass guitar followed, then the piano. One by one, the instruments found each other again, not with the explosive confidence they had carried only moments before, but with something deeper, something quieter, something that seemed to carry the weight of everything that had just happened. Elvis slowly raised the microphone. He looked toward the sweet inspirations. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. He stepped aside, not behind them, not in front of them, beside them. The audience noticed immediately. For years, concert-goers had become accustomed to seeing backup singers standing several steps behind the star, almost invisible, almost forgotten. Tonight, Elvis intentionally erased that distance. The four women now stood shoulder to shoulder with him beneath the brightest lights on the stage. The symbolism was impossible to miss. A murmur spread through the arena. Some people exchanged surprised glances. Others quietly smiled. Far toward the back of the building, a middle-aged woman reached for her husband's hand. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched. Elvis turned toward the band. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Let's try that again." The opening line of Suspicious Minds returned. This time, it sounded completely different. Every lyric suddenly carried another meaning. Every harmony seemed heavier. The sweet inspirations answered Elvis with breathtaking precision. Their voices no longer sounded merely beautiful, they sounded fearless. Each note climbed higher than before. Each harmony seemed to wash over the audience like a wave. Inside the arena, people stopped singing along. Instead, they listened. Really listened. Somewhere near the front row, a little girl quietly leaned against her father's shoulder. She stared at the women on stage with wide eyes. Years later, she would remember almost nothing about the songs, but she would never forget the courage she witnessed that night. As the final chorus echoed through the Colosseum, the audience erupted, not with wild screams, not with excitement alone, but with gratitude. Thousands of people rose together. The applause rolled across the arena like distant thunder. Some wiped tears from their faces, others embraced complete strangers sitting beside them. Even several members of the security team quietly applauded. Elvis lowered his microphone once more. The applause continued. Longer than usual, much longer. He looked toward the sweet inspirations. "You've carried enough tonight," he said softly. "I think these folks deserve to hear your voices." The women looked at one another in surprise. One of them shook her head slightly. "You don't have to do that." Elvis smiled. "I know. That's exactly why I want to." The band leader looked confused. This had never been part of the program. The printed schedule listed every song, every transition, every lighting cue. None of this was planned. Elvis walked toward the conductor. He whispered something. The conductor looked surprised, then smiled. Within seconds, the musicians quietly rearranged themselves. The spotlight operators shifted every beam away from Elvis. Instead, 4 brilliant white circles of light illuminated only the sweet inspirations. The audience noticed immediately. A wave of whispers spread through the building. Elvis walked several steps backward, then folded his hands in front of him. Tonight, he was no longer asking people to look at him. He was asking them to listen. One of the women stepped toward the center microphone. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, from emotion. She closed her eyes, took one deep breath, then began to sing. The first note floated through the arena with astonishing clarity, pure, warm, powerful. The second voice joined, then the third, then the fourth. Their harmonies wrapped around one another so perfectly that many people forgot to breathe. No elaborate stage effects, no fireworks, no dramatic choreography. Only 4 extraordinary voices filling an enormous room with hope. The entire arena remained silent, not because they were uncertain, because nobody wanted to interrupt what felt almost sacred. Near the side of the stage, several road crew members quietly removed their hats. The lighting director wiped tears from his eyes. Even hardened security guards stood completely still. The song ended. For one heartbeat, absolute silence. Then, the arena exploded. The standing ovation was unlike anything the performers had experienced. It seemed to go on forever. The women embraced each other through tears. One covered her face with both hands. Another laughed while crying. They had spent years singing behind famous names. Tonight, for the first time in front of such an enormous audience, they were being celebrated for their own voices. Elvis slowly walked back beside them. He waited until the applause softened. Then he raised the microphone one final time. "I've been blessed," he said quietly. "People have called me the king." He smiled modestly. "But no one stands on a stage alone." He looked toward the band. The musicians, toward the crew. The people behind the curtains, toward the lighting booths. The men and women nobody ever sees, then toward the sweet inspirations. And the voices that make every song complete. He paused. If tonight reminded us of anything, it's that greatness is never built by one person. It is built by people willing to stand together. The audience answered with another wave of applause. Far beyond the walls of the arena, no one yet realized that by sunrise, newspapers across the country would be trying to describe what had happened inside that building, and many of them would fail. Because some moments cannot be measured by headlines, only by the lives they quietly change. The applause refused to end. 1 minute passed, then another. Still, thousands of people remained standing. Some were clapping, some were crying, others simply stared at the stage, as if they understood they had witnessed something far greater than a concert. The sweet inspirations stood together beneath the bright lights. For the first time that evening, the fear that had followed them onto the stage had disappeared. Not because the world had suddenly changed, but because for one unforgettable night, they no longer felt invisible. Elvis quietly stepped toward them. Without saying a word, he placed one hand gently on the shoulder of the woman standing closest to him. It was not a gesture for the cameras. It was not meant to create tomorrow's headlines. It was simply human. The audience noticed. Another wave of applause rolled through the arena. Slowly, the lights dimmed. The final song ended. The musicians lowered their instruments. The curtains began to close, but almost nobody moved toward the exits. Instead, people remained standing in the aisles, talking quietly, looking back toward the stage, trying to understand what they had just experienced. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely different from the one before the concert. No nervous whispers, no uncertainty, only silence filled with emotion. One of the sweet inspirations removed her gloves. Her hands were still trembling. She looked toward Elvis. "I've sung in churches. I've sung in clubs. I've sung behind some of the greatest performers in America." She paused. "But I've never experienced anything like tonight." Elvis smiled gently. "It wasn't just my stage. It belonged to all of us." Another singer quietly wiped tears from her face. "There were moments," she whispered, "when I wanted to walk away. When I heard those words, I thought we should finish the show and leave." She lowered her eyes. "Thank you for not leaving us alone." Elvis looked at the women for several seconds before answering. "My mother taught me something when I was a little boy. If someone is treated without dignity, and you stay silent, then your silence becomes part of the problem." Nobody spoke after that. The room became perfectly still. Outside, reporters were already gathering. Photographers waited near the backstage entrance, not because they had planned to cover anything extraordinary, because word had spread unbelievably fast. Something had happened inside the arena. Nobody seemed able to explain exactly what. Only that people had walked into the building expecting entertainment and walked out talking about courage. The following morning, newspapers across the country carried stories about the concert. Some praised what had happened. Others criticized it. Editorial writers debated it. Radio hosts argued over it. Letters poured into television stations, some filled with admiration, others filled with anger. But almost every headline agreed on one thing: something unforgettable had happened in Montgomery. For weeks, the conversation continued, not only among journalists, but inside homes, schools, churches, restaurants, music studios. People who had never attended the concert found themselves discussing the choices made on that stage. Some believed music should never involve difficult conversations. Others believed music had always carried the power to unite people who would otherwise never stand together. The sweet inspirations discovered something had changed as well. After the concert, people no longer introduced them simply as backup singers. Audiences wanted to know their names, their stories, their voices. Record producers who had once overlooked them suddenly began paying attention. Interview requests arrived. New opportunities followed. doors that had remained closed for years slowly began to open. One evening, several weeks later, the four women gathered after another performance. One quietly asked, "Do you think people will remember that night?" Another smiled softly. "Maybe not every song, maybe not every word, but they'll remember how it made them feel." Years passed. Concert stages changed. Musical styles evolved. New artists appeared. Old legends faded. Entire generations grew up without ever setting foot inside the Montgomery Coliseum. Yet the story continued to travel. Crew members told it to young musicians. Parents shared it with their children. Performers repeated it backstage before walking beneath bright lights. Not because it was the greatest concert ever performed, not because every person in the audience suddenly agreed with one another, but because it reminded people that every stage offers more than an opportunity to perform. Sometimes, it offers an opportunity to choose fear or courage, silence or compassion, convenience or conviction. Many years later, an elderly stagehand who had worked that night was asked what he remembered most. People expected him to describe the applause, or the music, or the famous performer standing beneath the spotlight. Instead, he smiled, looked toward the old photographs hanging on the wall, and quietly answered, "I don't remember who stood in the brightest light. I remember who refused to let others stand alone." Perhaps that is the true measure of greatness. Not the number of records sold, not the size of the audience, not the awards displayed on a shelf, but the willingness to use influence when it matters most. Because applause fades, concert lights eventually grow dark, curtains always close. But kindness has a remarkable way of echoing long after the final note has disappeared. And somewhere, long after the arena had fallen silent, long after the last chair had been folded away, long after the newspapers had yellowed with age, the memory of one extraordinary evening continued to remind people that music can entertain the ears. But character is what truly reaches the heart. And sometimes, the most unforgettable performance is not the song that is sung. It is the decision that is made when the music suddenly stops.